Good morning. I'm Malcolm WOODMAN, formerly of BP, now an independent consultant. What I'm going to present here today is the Interoperability SIG Progress Report for 2017, as presented at the recent CAPE-OPEN annual meeting in Sunbury. The slides I'm going to use today are identical to those used in the actual meeting, but I can't guarantee that I'll say exactly the same thing to them, so there will be some differences. Let's start by looking at the Interoperability SIG Charter. Basically, we are here to ensure that we have interoperability within CAPE-OPEN and to carry out interoperability testing when requested. Our key responsibilities: first of all, to provide new tools for interoperability testing as requested by PMC and PME developers and the wider CAPE-OPEN community. We also develop and maintain the existing CO-LaN portfolio of software tools, things like the CAPE-OPEN logging and testing tool, COLTT. And we also have a large number of third-party vendor software available to us, licensed to us, that we can use for interoperability testing. This charter is unchanged from previous years. Membership of the SIG. There's 3 of us currently active. Myself as leader, Michael Halloran, who is a CO-LaN contractor. His full-time job is with Aviva. In his spare time, he works for CO-LaN, and Michelle Pons, the CO-LaN Chief Technology Officer. How do we work? First of all, we have monthly conference calls to actually see how we are progressing and to identify the next actions that need to be undertaken. In between those conference calls, Michelle and Michael develop and implement new software, they test that software and resolve any defects in all the software that we currently support. Our work process relies on repositories, and I'll say some more about that in a minute. In fact, going straight on into repositories, we have a set of repositories, a set of projects within repository hosting. These were originally set up and are now managed on behalf of CO-LaN by the Interoperability SIG. We have one project for each CO-LaN product. Things like CAPE-OPEN logging and testing tool, COLTT, the IDL and type libraries, tester suite examples, COBIA has its own project, etc. The management board has its own project for documents, for example. Each project has the ability to defect track using the track system. We can set up wikis, we can have downloads on a per project basis. The use of these projects ensures we have traceability of the software versions, and the use of the projects also enables collaboration. Each project has different access rights, so we can restrict the access to them to the correct people. More than 100 accounts have now been created in repository hosting for CAPE-OPEN members. The original SourceForge projects for things like COLTT have now been deleted, so if you search in SourceForge, you will not find them. So what have we been doing in 2017? The major focus has been on the type library installers. The final version of the version 1.1 type library installer has now been released and has already been downloaded more than 150 times. It is our belief that this type library installer must be used by all CAPE-OPEN developers, hence the should/must question mark here. The only proviso on that is if a developer does not install the type library at all as part of their software, then you obviously don't need to use the type library installer. We've issued a developer guide which has been reviewed by all interested parties, modifications made and then approved for release by the management board. There have been more than 200 downloads of that developer guide. Earlier in the year, we had a conference call with the vendors to explain the rationale and the expected usage for the type library installer. We've also created a lessons learnt document which covers the lessons from both software design and the testing process. We believe these lessons are applicable to all software development projects undertaken by CO-LaN, not just those within the Interoperability SIG. Looking at those lessons learnt in more detail, the Scope of the development and the assumptions being made about vendor software and environments should be made very early on in the development process. When we did the type library installer, we made a couple of assumptions about environments that were actually incorrect, which required rework at a late stage of the project. We should also define the test scenarios and have them reviewed early in the development process, as if we'd have done that, the incorrect assumptions would have been shown up much earlier. And we should agree a test program with the software vendors, and that should be done prior to publication to ensure that it covers everything that the vendors require. Such a test program may be a formal beta test phase, but not necessarily. Okay, so that's what we've done on the type library installers up until now. Recently, there has been a request to add new IDL to the type library. M&T are developing a new flowsheet monitoring interface specification, which will create new IDL. This IDL is additive, i.e. it doesn't change any existing IDL for any of the existing specifications. So we've been asked to define how we want to handle this. One option would be to include directly into the version 1.1 type library, but it is our belief that this will result in confusion because then there will be two versions of the version 1.1 type library and it will be very difficult to know which one is actually in use. So our recommendation is to actually create a new type library in PIA a version 1.2, which will reference the existing version 1.1 IDL, but will add the new flowsheet monitoring IDL. An updated version 1.2 type library installer will then install all three versions of the type library in PIAs. We would expect all vendors to start using this new type library installer with their next release. However, because backwards compatibility is maintained, there is actually no mandatory requirement to do so. And we will be conducting a survey to gather the views from all vendors, although we did actually obtain a lot of information from the meeting itself. As I said, most of the work in 2017 has been on the type library installers, but we have managed to make some developments on COLTT. We are developing an updated roadmap for COLTT, and there will be a future request for feedback on the proposals that we make in that roadmap. Once any changes have been made, the management board will need to approve the revised roadmap before we start to make any future developments. We have now produced a 64-bit version of COLTT, which sits alongside the previous 32-bit, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There have been more than 40 downloads of each of the 32-bit and 64-bit versions since July 2017, and the previous version of COLTT had been downloaded more than 200 times, demonstrating that COLTT is actually in use in the CAPE-OPEN community. Going back to 64-bit COLTT, the previous version of COLTT was 32-bit and was designed to log 32-bit PMCs, process modeling components. It therefore works in both 32-bit and 64-bit operating systems for both 32-bit and 64-bit process modeling environments, but will only log 32-bit components. It consists of a 32-bit viewer, controller, and logger. The new 64-bit version of COLTT is designed to log 64-bit process modeling components. It will therefore run only on a 64-bit operating system with a 64-bit process modeling environment and will log a 64-bit process modeling component. Therefore, if you have a 64-bit operating system with either 32-bit or 64-bit process modeling environments and both process modeling components, 32-bit and 64-bit, you will need to install both COLTT versions, and the user needs to select which controller to use, whether to use the 32-bit version or the 64-bit, depending on the process modeling component being logged. That is not an ideal situation, but it gives us a way forward so that at least we can actually log 64-bit PMCs. One proposal in the roadmap is that we, in the future, have only a 64-bit version of COLTT. That will have a 64-bit viewer, a 64-bit controller, and both 32-bit and 64-bit loggers. There will then only be a single controller, and it will work with both 32-bit and 64-bit PMCs automatically with no user intervention. The downside of that is that there will be no support for 32-bit operating systems, but it is our belief that they are not in great use these days anyway. Moving on to COBIA, where the Interoperability SIG has been providing some support to M&T. We have provided feedback at various stages of the project, and our primary focus has been on achieving interoperability with current COM implementations of CAPE-OPEN. And we will continue to provide input as required, including development of test plans to ensure that the interoperability is tested fully, and doing full interoperability testing using the suite of CAPE-OPEN compliant software available to CO-LaN. We do have some questions which include, are the vendors actually going to rewrite their software to use COBIA? And obviously, if they do, then we are going to need their new versions of their software to do the interoperability testing. It's our belief that the advantage of COBIA will only be achieved if a significant number of vendors actually switch to it. Finally, the Interoperability SIG and CO-LaN in general has a backlog of activities, so where should we be prioritizing COBIA? And we'll look for the management board to advise us on that. Finally, the tester suite. There is an existing CAPE-OPEN tester suite provided by CO-LaN. It has not been used or maintained very much recently, but it is a proposal has been made that COLTT could form the basis of a future tester suite to replace the existing one. And it could form the basis for a self-certification process, which is a discussion going on within CAPE-OPEN, CO-LaN, and of which there's a session at this meeting. So any work on this is on hold pending feedback and recommendations from the management board. So that basically brings me to the end of this presentation on the Interoperability SIG progress in 2017. And at the meeting, we actually threw it open to questions. Thank you for your attention.